Hello, everyone. Welcome to the January 27th weekly radio address, 2010. This is Peter. Hope everyone's doing well out there. I am going to be talking at you for the next hour and a half, covering your questions and some other issues. And let's see here. The first thing I want to bring up is technical stuff. We have an international chapters meeting today at 6 p.m. That's Eastern Daylight Time. For all of you guys out there that are involved, it's been really great, the progress I've seen. I know many of these international chapter heads are going to be coming to New York, and I look forward to meeting a lot of you. So that's going to be great. There's also going to be a developers meeting on Saturday, February 6th in TeamSpeak at 20 hours UTC time. That's TeamSpeak in the programming team channel. That's Saturday, February 6th. I think I'll announce that again, actually. I think I have one more broadcast before that one occurs. But the development team is coming together. We have a lot of issues that we want to go forward with as far as website development and, of course, larger order issues with other websites, and then eventually into specific technical concepts related to the things that we talk about. Obviously, there's a train of importance, and website development is still something we're continually working on to make things a little bit more fluid. But those two meetings are happening, so there's lots of there's lots of teams that are emerging all over the place now that are finally getting active. I know it's been slow for some of the groups, such as the communications team, developers team, and other sub-teams, but we're going to start making a database of all these teams and their meetings and make sure everyone's aware of them and try to get as many people involved as possible, or as is relevant based on what medium you're interested in. Let's see here. I was informed by Brenton Eccles about about a document that was published by The Nation regarding Iceland, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. For the last year, Iceland has been undergoing a pretty dramatic collapse. In fact, I have a kind of an amusing memory of flying around last year and being on an airline that had television screens with different programs loaded into them, and one of them was a documentary on Iceland, which was I suspect was about 7 or 8 months old at that time. This was last fall, late fall, when the Icelandic collapse began, very violently, by the way. And this documentary was talking about all the great strides that Iceland had made in their revamping of the banking system, their use of privatization, how they were robust. And obviously, if you read between the lines, what had happened in Iceland was the same that happened in Argentina, which was just rampant credit expansion. More and more money created, put it in the system, creating a false bubble, which eventually blew everything out. Smaller countries are always going to be blown out faster than larger countries. The U.S. is on a very slow slide. Of course, the U.S. is in a privileged position because of how powerful the dollar still is, even though it's losing its rank as the world's reserve currency. It's a different paradigm, if you will, a different genre of collapse because of the size, but we're going to be seeing that nevertheless. And Iceland and Argentina serve as great proxies as far as what to expect in the United States and in other places across the world. In fact, there are many collapses happening right now, which really aren't getting that much notice. Let me just read a section of this Nation article that was written by Rebecca Solnit. For those of you that aren't familiar with this, there's just a few highlighted things I wanted to denote. You can read this for yourself if you type in, just go do a Google search for Under the Icelandic Volcano by The Nation, written by Rebecca Solnit. Quote, Iceland is now a country whose currency, the krona, has collapsed, whose debt incurred by banks deregulated in the mid-1990s is 10 times larger than the country's gross domestic product, and whose people have lost most of their savings and face debts and mortgages that can't be paid off. Sounds familiar. Meanwhile, inflation and unemployment are skyrocketing, and potential solutions to the crises only pose new problems. The present government may differ from the old, but not as much as the Icelandic people differ from their pre-October selves. They are now furious and engaged where they were once acquiescent and uninvolved. After going hat in hand for bailout funds to Washington, the Bank of England, and the European Central Bank, Iceland turned to Russia and reluctantly to the global lender of last resort, the IMF, that temple of privatization and globalization. Usually along with money, the IMF imposes its own notions of what makes an economy work, as it did in Argentina until the country's economy collapsed 8 years ago, leading to an extraordinary rebirth of civil society and social upheaval. In Iceland, the process was reversed. First upheaval, then the IMF. Now you have to insurrectionary, wow, that's a word I haven't seen in a long time. Now you have to insurrectionary public and new incursion of the forces of neoliberalism that helped topple the country in the first place. As economic hard times have spread, so have a spat of protests and insurgencies across Europe, of which Iceland's has only been the most effective so far, suggesting that a new era of popular power in the streets may be arriving. Iceland's upheaval poses the question of what the collapse of capitalism will bring to the rest of us. Last fall, major financial newspapers were already headlining, quote, "The end of American capitalism as we knew it," unquote. Capitalism is convolution. The quote, "The collapse of finance," and, quote, "Capitalism at bay," unquote. The implication that something as sweeping as collapse of communism 19 years earlier had taken place. I'm going to stop there. So you can see the dramatic aspect that's happening. And, of course, they are being hit with lots of debt schedules. And basically, when this was made aware to me, they wanted to bring up a petition. If anyone out there wants to support a petition for Iceland, I'm not sure the value of it at this stage, but you can go to savethepeopleoficeland.com. And you can participate in this petition. I'm not sure the value of it again. I often think these petitions, while they mean a lot, in gesture, they tend not to really do anything. But I wanted to throw that out there. And basically, Iceland, there's a chance actually, based on the communications that were given to me, that we could have one of Icelandic's parliament on the radio show to talk about what's happening. Evidently, this one particular woman is in support of the movement. I've had a lot of people contact me about Iceland, and you might have known, I think I mentioned this before, Iceland actually petitioned their main television studio to show addendum of many, many months back. And in fact, I got CC'd with about 4,000 emails when they were doing so, but I never really heard much from anyone in particular. I was kind of hoping to hear more about it. So I'm going to start thinking more about Iceland because they do serve as a great proxy for what is slowly happening around the world. And it could be a hub for some type of transition. I'm not sure. Iceland, of course, is a little deficient on natural resources. They're kind of like Hawaii in the effect that they have to import just about everything. But uniquely, their biosocial pressures and their energy problems have led them to geothermal, which, of course, is a great alternative. It's great to see that stuff in practice somewhere. But nevertheless, I'm going to keep that stuff in mind. I think it's, I'm going to keep Iceland in mind, and maybe we can start to open up a dialogue, and who knows if we can get someone from their parliament on and get our foot in the door. Maybe Iceland could be a stepping stone in transition. We don't want to throw anything to the wind, but that would be wonderful to see anything like that happen. We do need a government to help. While we talk about city stuff and creating a test city, if we could just find a government that's willing to move forward with even a fraction of the gesture of what we talk about, it would just be a brilliant, monumental stepping stone for our movement. So I will keep everyone posted, and if anyone has any other information on that or is following this, I think there's a section on the forum that's talking about stuff like this. So keep the information flowing. And where was I? Excuse me a moment. Sitting here looking at a massive sea of information between Zeitgeist Day and my film. I'm staring at about 40 books and just stacks and stacks of papers. My sense of organization is getting a little more chaotic as the days go by, so please bear with me. But, yes, before I want to go any further with questions, I would like to cover some quick aspects of the movement that come up over and over again that I think, based on the questions that I get and based on emails that I get, people tend to overshoot. They don't quite understand the larger ramification of some of these issues. So I want to just quickly hit a bunch of points real fast in regard to some very important issues related to the movement, the Venus Project, and a resource-based economy. The issues I want to point out very quickly: we advocate no money. People sometimes don't understand why. We advocate automation, especially, automation almost entirely, but, actually I'm going to stop right there because I'm not going to go into specifics on this. We advocate artificial intelligence to be used. There's one that gets a lot of confusion. We advocate a technological unification of the globe. Technological unification is required. I'm going to go into that in a second. We advocate no property, and people throw their hands up at that too, and they say, wait a minute, that's just too reminiscent of communism, because they have no frame of reference. And of course, we advocate sustainable city systems. Now, if you were just to bring that list up to general people, and also we advocate science as a methodology, which should go without saying, but unfortunately we're at the tail end of the dark ages as far as I'm concerned on this planet, so I guess I have to restate the obvious. But nevertheless, these points, when you bring them up, most people, if they don't have a frame of reference, they really don't know what to think of any of it. So I want to just quickly hit these points really quickly with the fundamental summaries to help you guys out there in case you ever encounter this. 1 second here. Okay, so no money. You go up to somebody and they say, oh yeah, the Zeitgeist movement, they advocate no money. And they might ask why. The reason we advocate no money is on multiple levels. The reasoning is on multiple levels. But here's the most influential one. It is utterly paralyzing because money creates established institutions. Money creates institutions that are forced, for their own survival, to perpetuate themselves. Therefore, progress is inhibited by money more than it is accelerated by it. I'll say that again. Money serves as an incentive only to a certain degree. Once you build an establishment, you have lots of people working for you, doesn't matter how honest or genuine you think you might be. The moment you have that type of establishment, and the moment something comes along to challenge whatever your advocation is that you make money off of, you are going to have a natural propensity to want to restrict the development of anything that might take away your market share. That is the underlying mechanism that governs the whole of society. That is why progress in, say, renewable energies is utterly paralyzed. That is why it is far too expensive because there's no mass production to create the type of renewable energy infrastructure that's required to move us out of our current depleting paradigm. So, why do we advocate no money? Well, there's many reasons for that, but the main one is it's socially paralyzing, far over it serving as any form of positive incentive for mobilization. It does not advocate change. Money perpetuates the stopping of change more than anything else. Scientific ingenuity, the history of scientific ingenuity is one long history of money being in the way of the development. I was just watching a documentary on Nikola Tesla, and it brought up a historically significant issue with J.P. Morgan. As many of you might know, Nikola Tesla was sponsored by J.P. Morgan towards the end of his life. Nikola Tesla really had a really beautiful social view. He felt that energy should be free. And he discovered that it was possible, in theory, to tap into the ionosphere to generate energy. And you can pull the energy down through a form of electrostatic magnetism, if I remember correctly. And he went to J.P. Morgan to get funding for this project, which in his mind would allow essentially free energy. And of course, that's a loaded word. It's not really free energy, so don't think I'm advocating, free energy. There's no such thing. Even the sun, while it's in extreme abundance, it's not free energy. The sun will eventually burn out, or something to that effect. He wanted to have exercise in an attempt to do something that would benefit the whole of humanity, which would incur a loss of money for J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan shut down the Wardenclyffe Tower project because he wasn't about to even entertain the possibility of all the people in the world having, quote, free energy, or energy in such abundance that they don't have to pay for it. It was a form of wireless energy. Now, you can argue the technical ramifications of that all you want. What doesn't change is the fact that when you're given the possibility to make something so abundant, to make something so available to everyone that money can't be made off of it, those in power do not have an altruistic sense. They want money. Those that are conditioned in the monetary paradigm of self-interest are going to push that stuff aside. And that is really where the problem of money comes in. Establishment orthodoxies will shut down progress for their own self-interest, and that is what we've seen generation after generation. And that's one angle of it again, but I want to leave it at that and go on to the next one, automation. Someone might ask, why automation? Two reasons. Actually, one main reason. Statistically, automation is more productive than human labor, and that goes for just about everything that you can find an automated application in anything that's mechanized today is more productive in operation than if you had people doing it. And the reasons for that are pretty much obvious. But I made chart points in the London lecture about how employment was inverse to productivity. We can look at the steel industry to see that one in play very easily. And this type of tendency is going to carry over into every other medium when it comes to mechanization. That is just the way it is. So what it means, it's more productive. So why should we be doing something that isn't as productive as something else when we can create an abundance through the latter? The only reason that we don't push automation is because people want to keep their jobs, because we're stuck in an ancient paradigm where you have to have labor for income. That is going to become obsolete, and the telltale signs are there. And it is, again, socially irresponsible for us not to push automation in all areas. And once again, the monetary system holds that back because the labor system is associated with the monetary system. So why automation? Because it is socially responsible not to automate. Third point, artificial intelligence. Here's one that gets blown way out of proportion, mainly because of Hollywood and the nonsensical things people see. There's only two things you need to know about our considerations of artificial intelligence regarding the reasoning. One, and I know this might be controversial to some of you, it is impossible for a human being to be objective. It is entirely impossible for any of us to operate with pure objectivity reminiscent of the way a computer works. We have appetites and desires. We have things that change our biochemistry and essentially our motivations that will lead us on paths where we don't even know it, because it's more or less subconscious, into self-preserving behavior and therefore non-objective behavior. Machines don't have that problem. A computer is not aware of the fact that it needs to be plugged in to work. And maybe it could be in the future, but it doesn't have to have the necessity of self-preservation. If we program that into it, I think that'd be a dangerous thing, frankly. I think there's no reason to do so. And that's again, a futuristic notion. That's a biased notion, actually. To say that it's even possible to do so is highly debatable as well. But the general fabric of artificial intelligence, of decision-making processes arrived at by computer processes taking in information, is as objective as you can possibly get. And that's the way society should be oriented. It should be a fact-based world with, and this gets me to my second point, with as much information taken in as possible to arrive at a particular conclusion or decision. So the second issue of an artificial intelligence is that no human being can possibly know everything there is to know at a given moment that is applicable to a specific discipline or medium or problem that needs to be solved. It is impossible for us to do so. Our minds cannot operate like that. At least I don't know if anyone can. No single mind can. That's why you have big board meetings of people that try to share ideas. In the future, you'll have an interaction with a database of information similar to Wolfram Alpha, which is already out there, and a couple other examples that are already out there that are doing comparative knowledge and associative system-based AI programming. So those are the two issues in regards to AI. Humans cannot be objective, therefore they need to be removed from the decision-making process at the highest levels. I'm not saying that no one makes any decisions. Obviously that's not the case. Our intents are still there. However, we simply can't take all the information into account, so therefore not only do we need the database of information available to us so that we can interact with, we also need the process to be such that it removes our biased opinions. So I hope that makes sense. Those are the two issues in regards to artificial intelligence. Fourth issue, technological unification required. People can give this all sorts of names. The most derogatory is one world government. Technological unification is not a basis of government per se. It's a way of monitoring all aspects of planetary resources and processes. The microcosm is the city systems that Jacques designs. The self-sustained systems, where everything that can possibly be created in one area is there. It's locality. Excuse me. It's local. You don't import strawberries from New Guinea. You're producing them right there. So technical unification of the planet is absolutely dire, and something that's going to happen one way or another if we maintain any form of rationality on this planet, because there are simply resources all over the planet that have to be monitored. And then once you get that step going, it goes to the next step of infrastructure, then it goes to the next step of statistical application and distribution, and so on and so forth, in a natural progression of decision-making, natural progression of conclusions based on simply the necessities of the population. I think if anyone wants more clarification on that, if they watched part 2 of the Iowa lecture called Project Earth, I think I explained that pretty well, where you don't even need a Congress or anyone to make the decisions about how to manage resources, because it becomes absolutely self-evident based on the goal of maximum sustainability and global preservation. So that's it. Technological unification isn't some despotic idea. You could even still have countries in a circumstance like this, so the countries will take on very different behavioral patterns because it's managed holistically, and there's really no other option. So anyone that says to you, oh, this is, we have lots of belligerents out there that will call things New World Order or call things, things that are related to all sorts of biases and superstitions out there, and they think that any form of technological unification, actually the best one is the Revelation 13 of this erroneous interpretation of one world government leading to the coming of Jesus again, the apocalypse, which, by the way, anyone that actually believes that is really waiting for that to happen. So you think they'd be an advocation of one world government if they want Jesus to come back, but that's beside the point. Basically, you have to have technological unification of resource management on the planet, and there's no other way to keep things under control and to understand what you have and to take into account the carrying capacity of the Earth. So if you ever run into that, it's a real simple answer. Usually they'll just ignore you, though, when you begin to state that. But nevertheless, I want to throw it out there for those that might have any confusion. Fifth point, why science? Why the scientific method? Our obligation is to methodology, not individuals. So we want to use the methodologies that have stood the test of time, which is the scientific method, a process of testing, a process of replicating to know what works and what doesn't, feedback from the natural world and physical law. This is the method of conduct that needs to be adapted by every single human being because there's no debate to it, at least not as if I can see yet. As much as you believe you can walk on the wall, the moment you try to do so, you'll fall down. It's called the law of gravity. It doesn't matter how much anyone believes anything. Unless it can be shown in the physical environment, then that belief has no value. So this is the methodology that has stood the test of time, that has given us everything that we have as far as the abundance that we have, the moderate abundance that we have, which we're losing, that has discovered the energy processes which has sustained and grown the population. It's time that we have respect for this process. Anyone that just shuns the scientific method, I wouldn't even know where to begin with that. Everyone is a scientist. Every single, even the most diehard religious person is a scientist in their general every day-to-day conduct, in their general evaluation of what they do, most of them, because they wouldn't even be able to operate if they didn't have that type of down-to-earth relationship on some level. Sixth point, the no property issue. Why do we advocate no property? Because it's an absolute waste to have the materialistic basis of property identification, which has been created entirely by advertising agencies. Property has been confused with identity. People think they are what they own. I think, what was that quote from Fight Club I thought was pretty good, that the things you own, you don't own them, they own you, I believe was the quote by the Dylan character, which is actually a pretty fair assessment. Basically, property as we know it today is the capitalist byproduct that is continuing to exploit and destroy and waste our natural resources. It is asinine for each person to own an automobile. The sad thing is it's become so ingrained into the idea of identity and the idea of freedom that everyone should have a duplicate of everything else, and hence less social capital, hence more stratification. There's many different angles I can take, which I'm not going to go into a tangent on at this point in time because I want to keep this fast and quick, at least I'm trying to. The issue of property and why we don't advocate it is because it is too wasteful. It is not sustainable for every single person on the planet to have everything everybody else has in a singular way. We don't want to keep duplicating everything. We want to make things accessible to everyone. Everyone has access. And when that's established, you're going to see a completely different cultural shift in the way people view each other because stratification will evaporate I'm just going to stop there. It's wasteful and the culture is heavily polluted by it. And the final point, which I already touched upon, was the city systems. The city systems serve as metaphoric representations of what the global system will consist of, which is a unified systems approach using systems theory, which has been around for a long time. This is nothing new, to show how everything can be self-sustaining in a city system, hence everything can be self-sustaining on the globe. So when we want to build a test city, it's to show that this is the way the global application should work, with all of these individual cities locked together into a larger infrastructure where resources which are required to go to everyone on the planet will have a mode of distribution to do so, in a system of preservation harnessing that is also the highest, most efficient system you can have. It's a little bit of an abstraction, but the point is the city systems are very critical because they serve as the metaphor of the larger global system of basically technological unification through a systems approach. Systems theory is the key word there. So I hope I clarified a few things for anyone out there that's been having some difficulties with some of these simple points. While people will give you all sorts of complex and clever arguments against these issues, which, I'm not even going to go into, which they think they might back you into a corner with, remember how specific those arguments are, and then remember the larger order issue. Will all things be resolved? No, they won't. There will always be issues. There will always be things to smooth out. But nevertheless, you can't deny what I've just stated because the logic is sound and has been proven by experience. These are what needs to happen. This is what needs to happen for sustainability. I mean, we're faced with three massive crises right now. This is something else that you can relate to people. We're faced with an economic collapse of a massive pyramid scheme that's global with many different layers, blowing up at different points in time across the globe. This has been capitulated by various stock market shenanigans, and even if that didn't happen, it wouldn't change anything. It would have been something else. It's a pyramid scheme, and eventually you're just going to, quote, run out of money. That's the only thing that can happen mathematically. You could put a stop to it. You could just put your hand down and say, no, we're going to stop it right now. The debt isn't real. The interest isn't real. The paper money isn't real. It doesn't represent anything. But that is still the paradigm we live in, and the chain reaction is going to continue. The second issue is the ecological collapse. We all know we've built an infrastructure on fossil fuels, which whether they go away in 10 years or 200 years, it doesn't matter. It's still unsustainable, and there has to be a move to get out of it. I'm not even going to talk about the waste, just the peak everything in the sense that the market system is further compounding duplication, materialism, distorted values in order to continue to sell things, and all that does is waste our resources in one direction. There's no schemes of recycling being put forward. In fact, I recently read how most recycling schemes as far as glass and paper and stuff have such a minimal effect because of the inefficiency of the processes that are used. And the other issue of reasoning has to do with labor displacement, and that's going to be a growing reality. I've talked about this before. I did at the end of the Iowa lecture. I cannot, and again, people will deny this and give you other angles, but for me, I really can't see how the jobs are coming back. I can't see how the motivation to stop automation, I can't see how automation, even in an economic collapse, is not going to be used to pull out companies that are suffering, because automation will eventually become cheaper due to Moore's Law and other things that have been talked about in the past. So labor displacement's a big issue, controversial one, and I give it that. There are variables I might be missing, but I think I really don't see how it's possible for society to continue the way it has unless we move into such an artificial basis of monetary exchange, like an information age, where it becomes so arbitrary and so detached from reality that it would just be pointless in and of itself. There's a book by Jeremy Rifkin that goes in that direction called, actually I don't have it in front of me right now, but he wrote a book about this possible new sector emerging, which I found to be very, very dangerous. I was disturbed when I was reading it. That's no comment on Rifkin, by the way. I like Rifkin a lot. He has a very exploratory mind, and while I might not agree with some of his conclusions, I think the angles he uses are actually very important. So anyway, I think I've babbled long enough. Let me go into the questions. All right, let's see here. All right, number one. Peter, you've mentioned in the future how ownership of creations and ideas will be an obsolete concept. While I agree with this in general, I think that when it comes to creations such as characters or stories, the creator of that idea needs to retain the, quote, rights to decide how the idea evolves. It cannot simply enter into the public domain the instant it is created, lest the unique vision of every individual becomes co-opted, undermining not only the creative impulse, but the virtue of the idea itself. All right, hold on a second. Okay. Well, first of all, the issue of ownership of an idea. Let's just break it. It doesn't even matter what the context is. I understand the general cultural issue. Let's say that I seemingly came up with an idea, it was put in the public domain, and someone took it and used it for purposes that I didn't intend, which is what you're implying. The first thing that would really motivate such a thing would be the monetary system. When there's no money, there's no reason for exploitation, and a great majority of the exploitive things that happen today are done for money. Once that incentive for exploitation is gone, then it creates a whole new culture. You have to ask yourself why someone would even bother to do so unless they had a genuine interest. I think, identification of ideas will continue in the future, but when it comes to restricting someone else's input on something else, I think that is inherently wrong. I think that it is very arrogant to think that your idea is really your own. All ideas are serially developed. Even if you came up with, we'll just assume the concept of a book. Let's say you have a character in a book, you've established the character, you write the book, and then someone else writes a book picking up on your character. Well, it's good. First of all, it's going to be obvious to the person reading, based on the identification, that one person's written based on another person's ideas. So the idea of it being stolen, I think, is limited. Secondly, your idea of the initial character isn't necessarily your own, because there's nothing that you think that is actually novel to you in relationship to how information is serially transferred. Every idea has to come from somewhere. Therefore, there's really no such thing as any one person inventing anything. And we've talked about this before. So if someone was to take, for example, the only issue comes down to motivation. If someone has a particular motivation to do something and someone else picks it up and changes the motivation, that creates a dichotomy of one person's pursuits versus another. Now, we know this happens, but it usually happens again in the monetary system. But those are the things that you deal with. It's not really, it's a moot issue as far as I'm concerned. I'm trying to think of a better example to give this outside of the monetary system. The only reasons I can think of are basically monetary related. So property as an identification. Here's a good example. We have the Venus Project, and they're working to do a copyright on their notion of a resource-based economy. This is simply to protect the concept because it's very important for people to know the association of the original concept. That is in the system that we live in today because there's so much distortion occurring. There's so many motivations moving in so many different directions, and usually monetary issues come into play. We have people using this name to get donations to their websites, which is immediately corrupt, because if anyone's going to donate money, it should really go to the Venus Project, because that's where these things are going to really start. So I would have to say that I can see your point, but I think that, while I am not an avocation of a lot of other groups that are going their own direction with our ideas, there's nothing we can do to stop it except disassociate somewhat from their usage of what we're doing. And I think that will continue in the future simply by declaring that one thing is this and one thing is that. I guess I see it as not a big issue. And I think the ultimate element really comes down to the core notion that there's really nothing novel. It's a complex question. I can think of many different caveats to go on. I think it's a very good question. But I think in context of what you're describing as far as characters in a story, I really have a hard time thinking that someone would go out of their way to hijack what you're doing, and especially in regard to something so trivial. It'd be different if it was something that was socially strong. There's always going to be conflicts in society based on conflicting ideas. And conflicting ideas are always going to exist. Our goal in the movement is to find the lowest common denominator to get everyone in line, at least on a basic fundamental level regarding the survival of the species, general sense of equality towards each other and treatment of people, awareness of the planet, which we need to survive. As far as semantic arguments between one idea versus another, counterinterpretations, philosophical notions, those are always going to continue, and I think that's really the context of where your objection comes into play. So to answer it once again very simplistically, with the monetary system, the idea of exploitation on your ideas being run with, I think are very minimal. For example, someone actually took Jock's book, The Best That Money Can't Buy, and rewrote it and tried to publish it through another publisher. It was acquired by Roxanne. She read it, couldn't believe that someone did this, and actually got the publisher to remove it because it was explicitly for monetary gain, exploiting the ideas. And I'm sure there'll be other people using our ideas to do the same in the future. That's just the way the environment is today. But on the greater level, the conflict of general interests of ideas, this will have probably a more profound, this will have a continual presence, I think. And having rights to protect something in a legal sense isn't the way to go. That it really doesn't change anything either if you think about it. Number 2. Peter, what justifies you to say that the Zeitgeist Movement is the activist arm of the Venus Project, while most Zeitgeist Movement members agree that our current society needs alternatives and that resource-based economy could be one of those? Some people don't necessarily like the idea that the Zeitgeist Movement is somehow tied to the Venus Project Incorporated. Okay, well, those are projections by people that are, unfortunately, they're moving in a way that, they're interpreting things in a commercial sense, avoiding the ideas that we're trying to express. The Venus Project is really just a symbolic term. Whether it's a corporation or not doesn't mean anything. It's a name that has an identification, and it references the lifelong social research of Jacques Fresco. Fresco is not just a set of ideas. I mean, he's denoting a worldview, really, a method to think about how to become sustainable as a species and how to overcome some serious problems that we're faced with. You know, people say, oh, Fresco, he's just one person. Why are we listening to one person? Again, no, he isn't. Fresco is a culmination of millions of people's discoveries and ideas in the scientific realm, because all education, again, is serial. So just because it's one individual that happens to have these great ideas, just like Albert Einstein or a lot of other individuals, doesn't mean that there's a lack of consensus. It's more to the effect that it happens to culminate in an oddly novel way within one person because of a unique life experience. That was a little beside the point, but let me further say that the Zeitgeist Movement is not the PR team for the Venus Project. We're actually here to set in motion a trend that can allow for a resource-based economy to be established. We have a critical role to promote the technical information, value systems, and social perspective entailed to bring a new social direction to the masses. Of course, once our current one declines to a critical stage, we do need a biosocial pressure, emerging biosocial pressures to get people to understand that there needs to be an alternative before it's too late. And the Venus Project represents a body of work which everyone's adding to and building upon, really. It's a method of thought. And again, the goal of sustainability of the species is a forefront issue. And from there, all the pros and cons are weighed in regard to a given action, and the direction takes on a life of its own, honestly, and the development becomes self-evident with these goals in mind and the methods, the scientific method being utilized. So to answer your question holistically, I would say that the Zeitgeist Movement is an advocation of a set of ideas that are in close proximity to the Venus Project and a resource-based economy. I say that in that capacity simply to show that there are lots of other ideas which will come into play within the context that have not been denoted by Jacques Fresco. There are so many people doing tremendously good work on technology and sustainability, along with awareness of the corruptness of our current system, that all of this stuff comes into play. I just happen to feel that the Venus Project, and which is Jacques Fresco essentially, and of course Roxanne Meadows, has done the most amount of work for 70 years, given the most critical amount of thought, utterly dedicated in a way that no one else that I've ever seen has done. So therefore he deserves the attention. Therefore he not only deserves it, he is the basis of information to stem from, and that's what we're doing. And it also gives a tangible orientation. Imagine if we didn't have anything tangible to base it on. Imagine if we didn't have the city system blueprints, or we didn't have the sustainable architecture and the concepts of new materials that Jacques has engineered over his life. When people come to the movement, they'd say, well, how are we going to do any of this? The blueprints are actually there with the Venus Project, which is what makes this so phenomenal. We just have to overcome the current system. And that's where we come in. Number 3. Hello, Peter. What can we do about organizations like the Resource-Based Economy Foundation who have little or no support from the Zeitgeist Movement or Venus Project? There has been conflict between the RBEF and the Zeitgeist members. The RBEF members are slandering Jacques, Roxanne, and you, and telling everyone how useless they are, etc. Something must be done about these types of organizations that go off the Venus Project ideas and try to build cities on their own, creating confusion with new members about the goals of the Zeitgeist movement, the Venus Project. I think we must reason with them if possible, or have the Venus Project take legal action against them. They are making it difficult for the Zeitgeist movement activists to do their work with such division within the Zeitgeist movement. That is a good question. I've been very, very patient with the 5 or 6 offshoots that are out there, and I've just kind of been hoping that things flatten out. I've been so busy that I see the merit in what a lot of these organizations denote, but I'm definitely getting a little concerned with the kind of negative reactions they continue to have against the movement and the Venus Project. Any organization that slanders Jacques and Roxanne is not an organization that we support, naturally. I'm not going to jump to any conclusions. If any organization out there that's a splinter group, an offshoot that thinks they can do everything better and they're going to continue to kind of fight us, they're just going to be regarded as spam on the forum, and I'm just going to have to basically move them out of the wiki and everything else and completely disassociate. In the end, I'm not really that worried about it. I am worried about groups that are going to abuse members or people that aren't informed about this issue by using money. I think there was some organization, this Atlas something, that was taking donations in relationship to essentially an association with resource-based economy, the Zeitgeist movement, and the Venus Project, and that is wholly against everything that we've described. The movement itself does not even take donations for very clear reasons. The only donation structure where any money should go should be the 501c of the Venus Project, because that's where things are going to materialize structurally. So there's the issue. In the end, they don't have an audience, so don't really worry too much about it. Once my new film comes out, once I get the other sites established, there's going to be a massive railroad to move towards the Zeitgeist movement. I think all the third-party organizations will dwindle because no one's really going to be paying attention to them. And hopefully they will recede and come back and help us as a concentrated whole, because we do need people to work together in the same direction, and hopefully that will be the case. Otherwise, the motivations are inherently wrong for most of these organizations. We should be focusing on communication. And I know I've said this over and over again, but if you walk down the street and you pay attention to what you see, I don't care if you build a $200 billion city that's 17 miles in diameter that has everything constructed. You drop any of the general culture into that city today, they will be like apes in a laboratory. I hate to be extreme on that statement, but that is essentially how I feel. It's going to take a value adjustment that is extremely difficult, and that is why our focus is what it is. That is why the Zeitgeist Media Project will be up very soon. That is why I'm moving forward with more films. That is why I'm an advocation of the communications team and various protocols. That's why we're having this massive Z-Day event, which we already have about 100 events happening, and we still have about 6-7 weeks to go, which is great. That is why we're doing what we're doing. And if these other organizations feel that's not priority, then I can't help but dismiss them, because while I do advocate the test city and the understanding that we have to move forward with technological innovations to prove our point, eventually, until the public's ready for it, it's not going to do anything. And I think Jacques made a great comment about the community stuff, too. Actually, I think the next question says something about this. Let me read the next question. Number 4, hello, Peter. I was just wondering if you could restate the reasons why communes and communities of people getting together is not the final goal and is detrimental to the movement. How about the aspect of survival? Do you think people getting together to survive the collapse to get to a transition resource-based economy is bad or detrimental to the movement? Thank you, Peter. Okay, 2 questions there. As far as the reasoning why communes and communities are not the final goal is very simply, let's assume you create a high-tech community and the world collapses around that community and the community survives. Guess where everyone's going to go once their systems collapse? It's not safe. You can't do it like that. I know it's very difficult. You'd have to build some huge, huge fences around your supposedly peaceful resource-based economy community in order to maintain yourself. Self-preservation is going to be a telltale destructive aspect of the next couple decades because of the turmoil and conditioning of the public. So while, again, I'm an advocation of a test city that shows the examples of what we're doing to show the systems approach, it's not going to help to just build some community somewhere unless a government is behind it, which can protect it, which unfortunately would be the reality as time moves forward, I feel. As far as the second part of this question, survival aspects. Everyone has to take it upon themselves to stay educated in regard to keeping yourself afloat with the growing troubles that are emerging with the economy, with our ecological problems, with the biosphere, pollution, with the food shortages that are going to materialize. There's only so much you can really do except get on board and make people understand that there is another direction. And while, again, I'm focusing on communication, it is still only the first stage. And if we get enough numbers together, there will be larger order issues that will be taken to begin to challenge the establishment. So I wish I could be more optimistic. We're not a survival group. We're not here to just save ourselves and let everyone else rot. It can't work that way. It can work that way for a little while, which has been proven, as history has shown. But, you know, everyone just moving to some island and starting a resource-based economy and forgetting about the rest of the world will only survive for a little bit of time. So I hope you understand what I mean when I say that the survival issue is very complex. And it really comes down to being a social activist in a holistic sense. That's the bottom line. There are patches along the way, but we have to engage globally. Number 5. Hi, Peter. You said numerous times that we are still in the first phase of this movement, which is getting people educated and involved. What do you think we'll be able to advance into? When do you think we'll be able to advance into step 2? Are we just aiming to get a large enough percentage of the population involved, or are we waiting on something else? When we will move into step 2, if you want to use that notion, would be when the numbers are large enough and society has reached a point of awareness where our actions would be taken seriously, where we would challenge the establishment through various peaceful means. I'm not going to go into details on that because they're contingent upon the period of time where certain issues are occurring. And as far as waiting on something, yes, we have. Doesn't matter how much you go out there and rally people, if they're still comfortable sitting on their couch, drinking beer and watching American Idol, and they just see the collapse of the economies around them as being something on TV that they can just change the channel from, which is typically the case for most people, they're not going to change. It's going to take a certain degree of collective suffering, unfortunately. I don't know how else to put it, and I know people don't like hearing that. We are trying to create a pillow, if you will, a buffer. We don't want the entire system to collapse. I don't want that. We need the infrastructure. We need everything in place to move forward. We need the rest of the fossil fuels on this planet to move into a new paradigm, one that is based on renewable energies, based on the sun, gravitational pull of the moon, and the tremendous obviousness of how abundant energy really is if we just simply tried to harness natural outlets for it. So to answer your question, I do have a lot of ideas once we reach a larger critical mass. And in the end, there's a waiting game involved. Now, education is still the most important thing. If we can get people involved, every time you meet somebody that has just lost their job, and sit down and try to explain to them the nature of how our economy is based on people losing their job. Our economy is based, it is implicit in our economic structure for foreclosures, debt, collapse, and bust. And it is just a part of the system. And if they're tired of that pattern, then maybe they'll be motivated to join us and help us revolutionize the system when it comes to a monetary system to completely abolish it. So I'm going to leave it at that. I don't want to belabor that. I, again, apologize. I can't give you more details. I don't think it's expedient to do so at this stage because it might give people the wrong ideas as far as what they should be doing. Number 6. Hold on a second. Number 6. Wouldn't you agree that the problems we humans have today are not only technical problems, but also psychological problems? If so, shouldn't we address the psychological problems first? Problems like war, greed, violence, brutality, rape, desire to have power, control, and so on have been with humans long before the monetary system. They have been there so far as the beginning of mankind because the psyche of man has never changed. It has been the same all along, just with other animals. I would say the monetary system is a symptom of the psychological problems, just as religion and other institutions. You cannot change the society or the system which we are living by, if you cannot change the psyche of man. I think that's why there are people who are having a hard time accepting the Venus Project, because their psyche is not changed. I think you hit I think you had some good points. I'd have to denote that more than 99% of human history has been non-stratified and egalitarian, without the immense, with evidence to show there have not been immense wars predating agriculture. It wasn't until we started creating a surplus and and dividing the surplus and making this mechanism of power, essentially, that's associated with owning resources and then eventually money, that a majority of the issues that you talk about really came to fruition. If you're in a position of scarcity, however, which ancient man, I think, there's evidence to support, obviously, then yes, you're pushed into violence and things like that, just as in the animal kingdom. Violence is a natural accord, because when a tiger sees a zebra, he knows that the odds of him catching it are a certain probability. Well, he doesn't know the odds, but he knows that he has to do quite a bit of legwork in order to obtain that. And of course, it's a violence-based thing. There's a general scarcity of survival. That's just the nature of the way the world seems to work. That isn't a very good example, actually, but I think you see the point. If people are in scarce positions, they will behave in aberrated ways to preserve themselves. Another reason why we can't be objective, as I stated earlier. So the psychological problems that you denote, however, which you point out pretty well, the psyche is a matter of conditioning. The psyche term you use is really a product of conditioning. The conditioning can be altered. I think that that's really all I have to say on that, honestly. We've talked about this quite a bit. There are massive psychological problems that people have from many angles, from projecting their own ideas to utter denial to just things that people do to protect their identities and their original ideas. I mean, the ideas that they've culminated through time and that they've created an emotional attachment to, religion being a good one. But these are environmentally created associations. So that's why the educational imperative is so important for the Zeitgeist movement. That's why we are doing what we can, is essentially to address as you put it, the psyche of man, the psychological problems that have emerged because of the current system. And, of course, to relieve larger order issues that have been prevalent for quite a while, which, of course, is the scarcity issue, which through deliberate preservation tactics and social organization on a global scale, we can overcome a great majority of the scarcity issues and at least have a system to deal immediately with scarcity issues when they emerge, as opposed to the makeshift world we live in today where everything is pretty much haphazard and at the whim of corporations who, again, make their money off of scarcity in most cases. So that's what I would say to that. Number 7. Peter, would you say that there's a place for civil disobedience in this movement? For example, should we advocate not paying taxes, openly disobeying certain laws, or other similar activism? Going back to the second to last question, civil disobedience is a very powerful tactic, especially with critical mass. I'm not going to give any ideas I'm not going to put any ideas in anybody's head about civil disobedience because I don't want to be responsible for poor actions on their part at this stage. Civil disobedience, to really have an effect, takes large numbers. And yes, I think there will be very much a place for civil disobedience. And I think the instability that you're going to see as time moves forward is going to, the instability you see as time moves forward is going to make civil disobedience a commonplace thing in the future. Most great changes have happened anyway. In fact, I think the anger stage of society, in the words of Michael Rupert, is actually upon us now, which I think is a good point. Disobedience is a quaint word to describe what could be in store for society as things continue to collapse. Number 8. Hi, Peter. How would the movement react in the event of a loss of communications, say due to blackouts, due to the quite possible collapse of our societies, since we are currently heavily internet-based? Shouldn't we have a backup communications plan? Oh, I wish it was that easy. I wish there was something that we could use to replicate the internet that would give us access to our communication mediums if there was a plug pulled. I am going to have to I'll have to openly consider that through time. I really wish I had the only way that we can facilitate what we've done so far is through the internet, and I unfortunately can't think of another medium for it. That's why the internet is so important. So I think really the issue comes down to, if there's a blackout, well, that is a whole different level. But if there was a reason for the internet to be pulled in some way, we'd have to have massive protests to warrant against that, and just make sure that such regulations cannot be put in place. And that is a part of our activism as things move forward. So I'm going to give that some thought. I've had that question a few times, and I unfortunately don't know the answer to it. Number 9. I've really become concerned about the potential extinction of a large number of species before a more sane social system can be implemented. If we do not act with more urgency, what do you think? I assume when you say species, you mean holistically. Well, the ecological destruction, environmental destruction that we're seeing, biospheric changes, yes, obviously the species destruction of many different animals occurs and will continue to occur. I want to just make one comment that there are so many species of animals on this planet that the extinction patterns are actually a natural phenomenon. Humanity isn't responsible for every extinct organism out there. While obviously I'm not dismissing what we've done, I think it's important to point that out. It's a natural phenomenon for cul-de-sac evolutionary things to occur and species to become extinct for many different reasons, not just evolutionarily, but for when there's poisons that are in the Amazon rainforest, when there's ecological destruction. So I'd say the real species that we have to be concerned with ultimately is us and the species of vegetation and the like that feeds us and helps us survive. What we're doing is human-centric, I would have to say, and in order for it to really be human-centric, we do have to take into account the overall ecosystem of the planet and all of the cause and effect relationships that help support what supports us. So it's not that, to say it's human-centric might sound like it's elitism for the human being, but if you understand, for us to survive, we have to have the synergy and symbiosis of the planet in accord, which means we do need, say, bees. I think at this stage, if the bees were to go extinct, we'd have a very difficult problem with artificial pollination, things like that we should be concerned with. But I think I've had a fair tangent on that question. Let me just read that again. The urgency of our actions don't change at this stage. We have to stop the mechanisms that are creating the pollution and creating the waste. And then the species that have suffered problems, other species besides the human being, that have suffered problems will be more likely to survive. Number 10. Hi, Peter. Hi, Peter. I have recently been looking at some Alex Jones videos and some other randomly negative people, and quite frankly, I'm shocked and disappointed to see so many people fight what is obvious. In the case of Alex Jones, I'm more disappointed that someone who is supposed to be educated and looking to make change has said, quote, that he has been doing a great disservice to everyone in that he has allowed Zeitgeist some breathing room when he has fully understood that the Zeitgeist movement is 100% New World Order, unquote. What is he getting at with this New World Order waste of time, and why do you think persecution, why do we get persecuted for such ridiculous notions? I think it is imperative to talk with someone like him again, as he has his huge anti-New World Order following, and it is just a shame that he continues down the path of making this movement look like something it is totally not. Okay, look, there's always going to be people out there that have issues with what we're doing. Some of them are more irrational than others. In the end, nothing anyone says to Alexander is going to change his worldview. He's a sociopath. And the people that follow him are basically consumers in his mind, and that's why he makes the film every 6 months. He's not going to change. His entire establishment, which is a monetary establishment, is built on the perpetuation of an us against them. Therefore, anyone that has a remote symptoms of anything that challenges the ideology that they are religiously oriented with, which is this non-globalization, non-whatever, utter ignorance of everything we talk about, they're not going to change. So all I can say is that if you come in contact with people that follow this rhetoric, sit them down and talk about the things that I talked about at the very beginning of this broadcast. The most cliche is the globalism thing. Alexander, he chooses to say that we're globalists, from what I understand, with having no idea what that term even implies in regard to the way we use it. We seek a technological system of resource management for the planet and a system of computerized interaction which allows us to arrive at more conclusive decisions based on as much information as possible, removing human subjectivity. If that is supposed to be a globalist agenda, then I'm sorry that he defines it that way. in the end, it's just a big waste of time with guys like that, and I really couldn't care less. But I appreciate your question, and usually I would have filtered that question, but I didn't have a chance to filter these. Because honestly, I just get sick of people bringing him up to me. He's a clown. Number 11. Hi, Peter. I was wondering what your opinion is on wealthy philanthropists such as Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. They have donated billions of dollars towards medical research, charity, etc. People such as the Rockefellers and Andrew Carnegie have also donated billions of dollars towards universities and colleges, especially the major ones such as Harvard. The Rockefellers are also known for donating billions of dollars to U.S. national parks. People would argue that because of this, the wealthy are not always greedy and corrupt and shouldn't be taxed more because they are more productive people in society who make the biggest changes and influences. Why would they use these examples to justify the capitalist marketing system? How would you respond to or refute this? Interesting. Well, you've entered a very complex situation, because in certain angles there is a degree of altruism with these characters that you've mentioned. But let me make some quick statements, because this is just too large of a topic. Okay, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett has publicly announced that he's going to leave the majority of his fortune, I think it's like $40 billion, to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's going to leave all of his money to one foundation, to a foundation started by another multi-billionaire, two of the richest men on the planet. Let me take something back here just to give a slight aside. Warren Buffett made his fortune by trading stock and equity issues and investment. If you look at the rhetoric of Warren Buffett, one of the things he'll talk about to a certain degree is called diversification. He knows that in order to maintain a certain balance and a certain strategy logically within the market system, which can be unpredictable, you have to diversify your portfolios in many different issues across many sectors. This is basic logic in the investment community. I find it extremely bizarre that Warren, knowing this importance when it comes to resolving a certain end, would donate everything he has to another organization that has fairly limited scope, of what they're doing. I'm not berating the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I really don't see what they've done yet. But the fact that you just leave everything there really just screams bizarredom to me. I don't know why he would do that. If I was that wealthy and I really cared, I would have a whole slew of organizations I would leave my money to, because that would be the logic of it. You wouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. That is insane, unless you have other motivations, unless it means something different to you than literally helping humanity. You also know that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is paired up with the Rockefeller Foundation, and they talk about projects that I think don't have much relevance. And again, I'm not going to sit here and go through their agendas. There's always going to be a tax write-off altruism for a lot of these organizations, a lot of these really wealthy individuals. Some of them, I think, mean well to a certain extent, and most of them load in their funds to organizations that magnify or represent their establishment. Why do you think the Rockefellers put all their money into their educational institutions? Maybe it has something to do with making sure what's produced out of those institutions represent what the Rockefellers' interests are. I cringe to point this out, but it happens to be relatively true. The Rockefellers were known, J.D. Rockefeller was known to do some investment in the research of eugenics, and hence the sponsorship of certain institutions like Rockefeller University. So there can be motivations that would seem altruistic on the surface, but are actually quite despotic underneath. The Ford Foundation, these powerful, financially driven institutions that seem altruistic, that seem to be composed of philanthropists, very often have their own motivations. And if someone was to say, well, what would you do with Warren Buffett's money? I could give you a whole list of things that would be readily positive for humanity. He shouldn't be giving his money to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The most critical thing that needs to happen is a revolution of our energy industry. So everything would go into renewable energies. All $50 billion of it would go towards maximizing and creating the ability to make mass production of goods in a monetary system, mass production of renewable energy mechanisms in our current system so they can be produced and provided for everyone at a very low cost because they're mass produced. I hope that makes sense, because basically the motivations are difficult to assess. and I'm not going to say anything more about it. These people, I think, do have positive interests, but I think they have their own worldviews and agendas, and they've, I think, unfortunately, been polluted extensively by the cliques that they're associated with. Again, I'm not putting them down. I really want to believe that those that have this type of equity will move forward in positive ways, but yeah, we'll see. We'll just wait and see. I've yet to see conclusions. I've yet to see the benefit of where this money's going. The money goes to, quote, research, but I've actually never seen something positive come out of these organizations. You can go and look at the history of the Ford Foundation. You can go and look at the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Mellons, and you have to ask yourself, when you look at what they've done with their billions and billions of dollars, what has really helped to serve humanity in any real way? It really hasn't. The tendency is for it to serve some form of self-interest in a kind of a covert way. So I'll leave it at that. Number 12. I am a high school senior, and every time I talk about the Zeitgeist Movement and the Venus Project to my homeroom teacher, she condescendingly refers to it as nothing more than propaganda. Some other, according to dictionary.com, there are several definitions of propaganda, some of which say something to the effect of spreading information that is harmful to the public or spreading false or exaggerated information to scare the public. Some of the other definitions say it is more to the effect of spreading of information to influence an idea or cause. My teacher uses the latter definition, I suppose. In that sense, you could call it propaganda. However, I want to hear your thoughts. Okay, well, propaganda could be used to justify just about any angle that any person, one or more people, promote to denote any form of direction. Propaganda does have a fundamental definition that is negative of a connotation. I'm sure your teacher means it in that context. So in that reflection, I find it to be idiotic that she would say so. If you have to explain to her that we're talking about transitional shifts of social conventions, transitional, let me rephrase this. Let me think of the best way if you were to approach a teacher. To redefine it as not propaganda, you'd have to denote a tangible relationship to the core elements of what the Zeitgeist Movement and the Venus Project represent. And I think if you engage her in the conversation of the issues I've talked about at the beginning of this radio broadcast, such as the need for no money, the reasoning behind automation, artificial intelligence, the reasoning behind property, no property, the reasoning behind using the scientific method, the reason for technological unification, these are not religious notions. These are not up in the air. These have a direct correlation to the physical environment and have, hence, a reasoning for them. Once reasoning comes into play, the idea of propaganda falls to the side. Propaganda is influence without reasoning. That propaganda is influence of information influence without reasoning based on feedback from the natural world, meaning there isn't an inherent truth to it. And I feel that everything that we talk about has an inherent truth to it one way or another. And I don't see any conversation where I can't make that clear. Even the most diehard people will admit to the things that diehard people against the movement will admit to the obvious problems of the things that we denote, but they often just shun it out because of their ideological understandings, their ideological indoctrination, assuming capitalism, socialism, free enterprise, fascism, communism, Judeo-Islamic Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, any ideology, again, that doesn't have a workable function towards the natural world and society when it comes to social beliefs is not a functional ideology, and therefore I don't really have much interest in it. But that's a slight tangent. So your denotion, the teacher's denotion that this is propaganda is a projection, and it's utterly baseless because she obviously hasn't really learned anything about what we're talking about. Rather than people dismiss us as propagandists or whatever they want, all you have to do is give them one point. Say, well, what about this issue? And let them criticize one issue. If they can't criticize a singular issue, which most often they can't because they've never researched any of it, then it's not worth wasting your time. Don't spend your time don't waste your time on people that have an overarching dismissal. If they don't have a specific point that they want to criticize and engage in a dialogue about, then there's no point. They have to have something to talk about other than just this bland dismissal. So anyway, I'm sorry. I think that I went on too far about that. Number 13. How much time do I have left here? Okay. Number 13, after researching the Venus Project for months, listening to your podcast and meeting with Jacques, I still have no answers regarding transition. The message I am hearing is that you need millions of dollars to build a research city. No, that's not the message, but let me continue. My question is, when are you going to give a straight answer on concrete transition steps real communities can take to survive collapse and move towards the resource-based economy? Further, are you aware that chapter members are getting weary of the lack of transitional steps? Transition to the Venus Project is extremely simple, and we are doing it in the Transition Project, so why won't you answer this question? First of all, I've answered the question of transition at least 150 times on this radio show. I'm going to answer it again. Unfortunately, people don't like the answer, therefore they dismiss it. I've also reviewed many of the, quote, transition projects come from third-party sources, and about 95% of these things brought up are basically pointless at this stage. It doesn't matter how articulate you can be about causality as far as monetary acquisition, the acquisition of resources to build a city. It doesn't change anything. Building the city, having the technological capacity, and getting the money are givens when the priority arises. That isn't the focus whatsoever in the transition. The transition is about the transition of culture. Transition is about the reality that most of the people on the planet are indoctrinated into a particular worldview that has no legitimate basis for sustainability, and they're based on old, ancient folkways that have been around for centuries and centuries. Until we overcome that sense of detachment from the planet, nothing's going to change. So my answers to the transition to you are very simple. We have to create a critical mass of people on a global scale with a certain degree of stability. Then we begin to have mass influence campaigns, which we're already doing, but we continue to do so. Then we will present political influence against the establishments of every single government. And from there, as the system begins to break down, we will attempt to provide a replacement for the current social architecture as things continue. This is not the savior of humanity. We're not going to be able to stop the problems that are in the future. It is impossible, I believe, until the biosocial pressures make themselves known and people begin to suffer more so. And to begin to understand that there is a direction that can be moved into, which can be moved into very quickly, to stop the suffering. But history has proven that rationality doesn't work. Humans are not rational in the sense that they can be told something and then they immediately act upon it. We are far too indoctrinated with biases to be able to operate in that capacity. We can't be objective. We have identifications that are emotionally correlated, and therefore barriers are put up psychologically. It's going to take something to mobilize people to understand that this is a possible direction to move into. This is a system that can work. It has nothing to do with communities, it has nothing to do with cities, except in the abstractions of what the cities represent. I hope I've made that clear. I've said that so many different times now. So, you put me on the spot saying, why won't I answer the question? Well, I have answered the question repeatedly. I think the person writing this is coming from an angle where they think that they have the solution. Well, if you have the solution, why are you asking? I'm giving the solution that I see, and it's not an easy one. It's a very complex solution. It is something that is going to materialize as time unfolds. It's going to be a growing resolution as conditions unfold. There is no other way to think about it. You or I cannot figure out what the future holds except in a general average of probability, and therefore we orient ourselves as such. Any highly detailed, quote, transition plan is utterly useless at this point because you cannot take into account the unfolding of political and social developments and various economic disasters which are impending, not to mention ecological disasters, which will need resolution more immediately if we intend to maintain stability in whatever regions those problems arise. I can't foresee the future. I don't know what will be the tipping point for the motivation for society of society for the motivation to be created to move into something new. These are the variables that we don't know. So everyone is going to have to understand definitively that until the world at large recognizes this direction, until there's mainstream coverage, whether positive or negative, doesn't matter. Until people know about it, there's no point in even considering a technological transition plan outside of what Jacques Fresco has already denoted. It's actually in his book. They talk about it all over the website. The city issue, again, is a step for education and not living. Number 14. Hi, Peter. As you once said, it's important for everyone to keep coming back to touch home base at this point, and that we keep listening to the lectures and radio shows to become better at relaying this information, yes. Is there ever going to be a point where we don't have to worry about people who are misinformed about the concept of the Venus Project? In other words, do we simply rely on having a strong pool of study members who can help you reorient misguided members? Well, to answer your question, is there ever going to be a point where people are not misinformed? There's never a point of absolute anything, I think. So whether people accept the social system holistically or not, historically doesn't really matter, because there are still people that live in societies where they don't fully agree with their social systems as they exist. But usually those are for very good reasons. I really think that after a good transition period, the basic understanding that we have to monitor the Earth's resources again, we have to have conservation and renewability in our energy sources and all natural resources, and we have to have a culture that shares values that will live together in a way that's somewhat, quote, harmonious, if you want to use that kind of word, and involve and develop and create a civilization. There's no dispute of any of that, and I think once people they can shed all of the things that have held them back with their ideologies, they will move forward in very, very pleasingly, because there's really no other direction I can think of. And I hate to sound so declaratory like that, but if anyone out there can find another ideology that's in existence that takes into account the carrying capacity of the Earth, that understands that we have to rely on energy and the conservation thereof, and the constant pursuit of better, cleaner, renewable energies, always taken into negative retroactions, and the monitoring of all the Earth's resources so we can understand what we have, and using statistical databases provide the public with everything that they need to survive and to flourish in a positive way, in a socially developmental way, I'd like to hear it, because there's not one social organization in existence that denotes any of those attributes. So, yeah, you're going to have to deal with the conflicts for now until people begin to understand that global management is a logical understanding. It's a logical conclusion. Excuse me. Number 15. Hi, Peter. There's a website claiming to debunk the money info and Zeitgeist addendum. Here are some claims I would like you to respond to. All right. Claim 1. Quote, the Federal Reserve buys bonds from the open market. It is forbidden from buying bonds directly from the Treasury because the Federal Reserve does not buy the bonds directly from the Treasury, but rather from the market, and thus is buying debt that already exists in the hands of others, and no new debt is created. Zeitgeist then claims that the Federal Reserve prints money, but this is actually the opposite of what happens. Okay, that's a whole weird slew of convoluted stuff. It's completely, bizarrely wrong. Okay, first of all, let me just state this clearly, because they're twisting. The Treasury produces the bonds. The bonds have no debt value until they're acquired, by the way. They are put into the open market. The Fed simply purchases these newly created bonds with newly created money in the open market. That's it. There's no mystery here. The public can buy them, and so can the Fed. In fact, if you want to do any preliminary research on the Fed and its processes for buying bonds, it can pretty much do so at will by simply communicating with the Treasury about what they want. It's a collusion. So that claim is completely bizarre. Claim 2. At the beginning of modern money mechanics, okay, this is the claim by the website trying to debunk. Quote, at the beginning of modern money mechanics, the booklet states it is only looking at the M1 money, something which Zeitgeist ignores and thus messes up their math and concept very badly. If a central bank has money printed ad infinitum without regard for consequences, it will certainly cause inflation. However, that's MO, but increasingly M1, as we have discussed, does not print money into existence. A bank cannot lend more than is deposited within. Wow, that's whoever wrote this is doing it in a fraudulently confusing way. Either that, or they're like 11 years old and they don't know anything about what they're talking about. First of all, the MO is irrelevant. M1 consists of coins, dollars, and checking account deposits, which is essentially the majority of money that exists. Modern money mechanics explicitly shows how this money becomes multiplied directly. Now, this is the causal relationship of monetary expansion. And anyone out there can download a PDF of modern money mechanics through a torrent, I believe, and read it themselves. I simply put the information presented in the video. So I don't know where the individual who wrote this claim to debunk got this nonsense. Then they state that a bank cannot lend more than is deposited within. No, that is absolutely wrong, and I don't know how you could even say that. It's explicit in modern money mechanics. Let me continue here. This is a waste of time. Claim 3, quote, inflation represents the falling value of money, but the rising value of commodities. The total value in the economic system remains the same. The supply of money by itself does not determine the value of money. That's unquote. That's their claim to debunk, I guess, my issue of inflation. This is childishly wrong as well. As any economist will tell you today, inflation has a few definitions, and one of which has to do explicitly with the increase in the supply of money, diluting the value of the entire currency pool. I'm not going to waste any more time with this. Even Alan Greenspan has commented on that phenomenon. There's no mystery there. The individual that wrote this obviously is trying to find anything they can to demean whatever angle they possibly can in the most deceitful way they possibly can. Either that or they're like 11 years old. Claim 4, quote, it doesn't matter at all whether or not money is debt because in capitalism people must always compete for jobs. They don't compete for jobs because of debt. They do it because they must sell the value of their labor as a means of making money. They don't own the means to create products or services, so they sell their labor to someone who does. Okay, well, you're completely beside the point. This statement is, again, deliberately empty and confusing. Selling one's labor or labor competition itself isn't the issue at all, and it qualifies nothing. It is the fact that there is a severe pressure due to the debt-based, interest-based monetary system, which is put on the average person, forcing them into an even bigger hole, an artificially bigger hole, than the system creates on the surface. It's one thing to have to work in our system just to meet daily needs without debt, and it's a totally different situation when the majority of people are in debt to banks for many, many years of their salary. Artificially, it's called debt slavery. If the monetary system was supposedly humane in any fragment, there would be an outlaw against making money off of money itself, therefore interest would not be charged, and there would be a mathematical model for distributing money based on resources, energy certificates. I don't advocate this, by the way, I'm just saying, which is statistically oriented, which means that debt cannot accrue at all. It's impossible for debt to accrue. That would be a humane monetary system. So anyway, and by the way, these claims come from a website called conspiracyscience.com, which I had the liberty of going through briefly while I was looking through these questions, and it's one of the most hilarious websites I've ever seen. I was blown away by the malicious twisting of just about everything on this website. So anyway, it keeps things amusing, that's for sure. There's nothing on that site that couldn't be debunked in about 5 seconds. Number 16, I'm running out of time here. Okay. Hi, Peter. How would you propose the enormous infrastructure of maglev trains be built? You spoke in Zeitgeist Addendum of being able to travel from New York to Tokyo in a matter of a few short hours. However, this would be perhaps the biggest undertaking to build such a system that mankind has ever embarked on. Would you propose using some of Jacques Fresco's technologies to build such a massive infrastructure, or do you see man building the maglev infrastructure, which would undoubtedly take decades to do? If the latter is the case, why would man want to do some boring labor, since that is what we are trying to phase out? Okay, we're not just trying to phase out boring labor. There are automation processes which we put in motion to help build the infrastructure for maglev trains. Look at the Venus Project's work on self-erecting structures and automated infrastructure stuff that Jacques has compiled. And in the end, even if people were involved in this, it is such a wonderful pursuit that helps everyone, they wouldn't need monetary reward for it. I'm not going to expand on that because I know people will have a dissonance on such an issue. We're not here trying to just remove everything from everybody, saying everyone can just be free, not to worry about anything. We're hyperbolating towards a system of automation for redundant and monotonous labor, yes, where a great majority of the population be free to pursue higher interests, things that have an actual social relevance more specifically. But going back to your main point, as far as the maglev trains, what I would advocate is simply redoing all the current train infrastructure that we have now and making them fit for maglev. I think you could have an underwater system created as well. I don't see the infrastructure to create the maglev is probably easier actually than creating traditional train systems if you understand the technology. if it was given the ability to be mass-produced in a quick way. The energy usage, of course, is only 2% that of plane travel. I want to throw that in there because that's extremely critical, especially those that consider our dependence on fossil fuels. And airplanes, we don't need airplanes anymore. We could have intercontinental travel through maglev. And if we started construction on this right now, and there was a full global initiative to do so through all countries, I think it would only take maybe 2 years to have a global infrastructure set up. Probably not even that, frankly. Global infrastructure set up for this usage. Again, it's the monetary system that holds that stuff back because of the establishments. So I hope that answers your question. Number 17. Hi, Peter. I thought about the practicality of using... Oh, there's another maglev one. I thought about the practicality of using maglevs for transport on a global scale, but I hit a snag when I considered how plate tectonics would affect the tracks. The plates underneath us are in constant motion, so how will maglev tracks cope with movement of plate tectonics? That's an interesting question. Well, first of all, there are still large train systems that work that have been dealing with those issues. Obviously, you would avoid really complex areas where there could be a lot of motion. That's a natural thing. But I think there would be technological resolutions to give mobility to tracks or to give warnings and make things easy to diagnose in the event that there's a problem. Obviously, a big earthquake is going to have a dramatic effect on just about anything. As far as general shifts of the plates, I don't see any reason why there can't be a technological solution to that can compensate for such motion, especially if you're doing an underwater type thing. These things do have resolution, I think. It's just a matter of, for example, say you have two tectonic plates, and they're over a particular area. You could create a more complex infrastructure that simply guides a transitional point, there's a transitional point for the train to move to one type of construction to another to compensate for that risk. So I really don't think that's a huge issue, and given the scientific ingenuity, there might be ways to elevate these trains so they aren't susceptible, and again, through memory metals and other forms of advanced technology and materials, I think there could be malleability in the movement of many of these structural projects. And Jacques is a very good authority on stuff like that. He thinks about earthquakes a lot. He's already constructed a lot of infrastructure that can deal with earthquakes and other natural phenomenon. Number 18. Mr. Fresco said he managed to change the values of a group of KKK members. How did he do this? I'd have to ask Jacques that in more detail next time I have him on, which I should probably have them on next time. But he did describe one thing he did to me a little while back, one thing he did for them, he described it to me a little while back, where he was doing a series of presentations to the group, and he would show videos with different information. He would show aspects of conditioning, and I think what he said was the final one that he showed to one group, and by the way, I have about 90 seconds, so let me make this fast. One group had to do with showing the audio, playing the audio of a British voice, and there was no screen. It was just the audio of a British voice speaking, and he asked the people of the KKK what their disposition was, what they can gauge from that person, who they thought he was, and the general descriptions given by the audience were that he was an intellectual, because it was fairly intellectual speech, and he was British, so therefore he's probably a white businessman working in technology or something. So he turns on the camera or the projector, and it's a black man speaking in a British accent. And at that stage, everyone was very confused, and they began to realize the effect of conditioning, and that was a big staple in his ability to transition that group from their racist tendencies. So anyway, I'm going to leave it at that for today. I really appreciate everybody continually listening in. I'm sorry I forgot to send out the email for this broadcast, but I'm happy to see people showed up. And I will be in touch very soon as things progress, and I'll have Jacques and Roxanne on next broadcast. So everyone, shrug along, and I hope to see more Z-Day events pop up in your areas. If you haven't made one yet, please try to do so. Even the smallest event will be very helpful. Thanks a lot.